On a cold, silent night, a poor, hungry boy sat curled up on a stone bench crying. His tears reflected the loneliness and despair surrounding him. A wealthy, elderly man, driven by an unexplainable compassion, approached with the intention to help. However, upon looking into the boy's eyes, his heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. A devastating secret connected these two strangers, and the truth, about to be revealed, would change their lives forever. It was a cold night in Rome, with a biting wind cutting through the deserted streets and weaving between the ancient buildings. Enzo Castellani, a stern-looking elderly man, adjusted his heavy coat as he walked through the alleyways. His steps were slow, burdened by the weight of his years and the emotional baggage he had carried since the tragedy that had torn his family apart. He always walked in silence, avoiding contact with anyone who crossed his path, in a lonely routine that repeated night after night. In a nearly deserted square, Enzo spotted a figure huddled on a stone bench. The boy was poorly dressed for the season, wearing an old worn-out coat, visibly dirty and shivering from the cold. Moved by a strange compassion, Enzo cautiously approached. His tired and sad eyes lingered on the boy for a moment, before he broke the silence with a hoarse and gentle voice. "Hey boy, are you hungry?" At first the boy didn't answer. He just kept his head down, his arms wrapped around his knees, as if he wanted to disappear. Enzo, persistent, knelt next to the boy, extending a loaf of bread he had bought earlier. "Take it, it won't hurt you." Enzo's voice, once cold and distant, now carried a softness he rarely showed. Don't forget to leave a like and stay tuned for every detail of this emotional story. Finally, the boy lifted his head, and at that moment, Enzo's heart stopped. The boy's eyes were large and frightened, but what truly stunned him was the face. It was too familiar, a painful memory he had struggled to keep buried. The boy in front of him was Luca, his grandson presumed dead in a tragic accident 5 years earlier. "Luca?" The word escaped Enzo's lips in a whisper, almost inaudible. Luca furrowed his brow, confused. He didn't seem to recognize Enzo immediately, but something in the man's voice and posture made him feel an unsettling sense of familiarity. Enzo, on the other hand, felt a devastating mix of joy and fear. It was impossible. He had seen the bodies. He had buried his son, his daughter-in-law, and supposedly his grandson. "Is it really you, Luca?" Enzo repeated, now with urgency in his voice, gripping the boy's frail shoulders. "How are you here? What happened?" Luca looked away, as if the mere mention of his identity pained him. He bit his lower lip, his expression revealing deep sorrow and fear. I don't remember." His voice was low, fragile, as though speaking the words was difficult. "All I know is, I'm here." Enzo's heart raced. What could have happened during those 5 years? How was Luca, whom he believed to be dead, here, alive, abandoned on the streets of Rome? "You're safe now, Luca." Enzo tried to comfort the boy, controlling his own emotions. "I'm going to take care of you. I won't let anything bad happen. Let's go home." Luca hesitated, visibly torn between trusting this man and the instinct for survival he had learned from living on the streets. But hunger, cold, and exhaustion won out, and he slowly nodded. "All right," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Carefully, Enzo put his arm around Luca's shoulders and helped him to his feet. The boy was thin, fragile, as if made of glass. As they walked down the deserted street, Enzo's heart was in turmoil. He could barely believe what his eyes were seeing, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something terribly wrong had happened. They made their way toward the Castellani mansion, and Enzo, now wrapped in a mixture of hope and despair, knew that this journey with Luca would only be the beginning of a painful search for answers. "Do you remember anything, Luca?" Enzo asked as they walked. Luca slowly shook his head. "No, I only remember being alone and hungry." "It's okay, son. Don't force yourself to remember right now. Let's go home. There, you'll rest and eat something warm. Then we'll figure it all out together." As they walked through the empty, echoing streets of Rome, Enzo couldn't help but think about the questions hammering in his mind. How could Luca be alive? And why had he been living on the streets? Enzo and Luca arrived at the imposing Castellani mansion, a monument of opulence that now seemed almost empty, reflecting the silence that inhabited Enzo's heart. He pushed the large wooden door, which creaked softly as it opened, revealing the vast hall illuminated by ancient chandeliers. The golden glow that once reflected a full life now seemed dull, lost in time. Luca hesitated for a moment at the entrance, as if that grandeur no longer belonged to him. His eyes wandered, trying to find some familiarity among the old walls and furniture. Enzo, noticing the boy's discomfort, gently touched his shoulder. "It's your home now, Luca," he said, forcing a smile, trying to hide the storm of emotions he felt. "Everything's going to be all right." But inside, Enzo was far from feeling all right. The confusion and the questions continued to flood his mind. How had Luca survived the accident that, according to authorities, had left no survivors? And why had no one looked for him? Every time he looked at the boy, a new wave of guilt consumed him. He had accepted the police's conclusions without questioning, without insisting on better answers. And now Luca was here, in the flesh, bringing up memories Enzo preferred to keep buried. "Do you remember this place?" Enzo asked cautiously, watching Luca's eyes as they scanned the room. Luca looked around again, confused. He took a few hesitant steps into the hall, running his fingers along a nearby marble table, as if touching a distant memory. "I think I've been here before," Luca murmured, his voice weak, "but it feels like it was a long time ago." Enzo felt a sharp pang hearing those words. It was painful to see Luca so distant, lost in his own fragmented memories. The boy, who used to run through the mansion's halls laughing and playing with his parents, was now just a shadow of the child he once was. Enzo knew he had to be patient, but the urgency to know what had happened was growing by the minute. "Come, I'll take you to your room," Enzo said, guiding Luca up the wide staircase adorned with luxurious carpets. Each step echoed through the house, and the silence between them was almost palpable. Luca followed Enzo, but his eyes wandered over the details of the mansion as if he were trying to recall something that refused to come to mind. They finally reached a room on the second floor. Enzo opened the door and gestured for Luca to enter. The room seemed untouched, exactly as it had been left years before. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a large, comfortable bed dominated the center of the room. Toys were carefully arranged on a shelf in the corner, as if time had stood still since Luca had last been there. Luca walked over to the bed, running his hand over the soft bedspread. He seemed confused, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't make sense. "I used to sleep here, didn't I?" Luca asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Enzo replied, his voice trembling. "This was always your room, Luca. And now it's yours again. Here, you can rest. You're home." Luca nodded, but his face remained tense, uncertain. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his thin, dirty hands in his lap. The discomfort was evident. Though he was physically safe, something inside him seemed deeply wounded, and Enzo knew it went far beyond hunger and cold. "You must be hungry," Enzo said, trying to sound more upbeat than he felt. "I'll have them prepare a meal for you. You don't have to worry about anything." Luca nodded, but his gaze stayed distant, lost in thoughts he couldn't seem to organize. Enzo left the room for a moment, heading to the kitchen to arrange something for Luca to eat. When he returned, carrying a tray with a simple meal, he found the boy sitting in the same position, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Here, Luca, you need to eat," Enzo said, placing the tray on the small table beside the bed. Luca took the fork, hesitating for a moment before starting to eat slowly. With each bite, it seemed as though he was trying to reconnect with something, but suspicion still lingered in his eyes. Enzo sat in a nearby chair, watching the boy in silence, searching for clues about what he had gone through. After a few minutes of silence, Enzo broke the tension in the air with a question he knew he had to ask, but dreaded the answer. "Luca, do you remember anything? About the accident, about your parents?" Luca's fork paused in mid-air for a moment, before he lowered his head, frustrated. He shook his head slowly, avoiding Enzo's gaze. I don't remember. I only remember being lost." His voice was filled with sadness and confusion. "I don't know what happened." Enzo felt a tightness in his chest. The confusion and pain in Luca's eyes were almost unbearable. But at the same time, the relief of knowing he was alive was enough to fill Enzo with a hope he thought he had lost forever. "It's okay, my boy," Enzo said, trying to hide his own emotions. "You're safe now. We'll figure out what happened together." The next morning, the soft light of the sun filtered into Luca's room through the heavy curtains, casting a golden glow over the space. Enzo entered the room quietly, observing Luca still asleep. The boy's expression was peaceful, but his body remained tense, as if even in his dreams he couldn't escape whatever was haunting his mind. "Luca," Enzo called softly, approaching the bed. "It's time to get up, my boy." Luca opened his eyes slowly, still confused by his surroundings. For a moment he looked at Enzo as if expecting to be somewhere unfamiliar, but soon he remembered where he was. The Castellani mansion. His gaze wandered around the room again, as though searching for answers his mind couldn't yet provide. "Did you sleep well?" Enzo asked, sitting beside the bed. Luca nodded slowly, but his face told a different story. He was physically present, but his mind seemed distant, wrapped in a fog he couldn't clear. "Maybe some breakfast will help you feel better," Enzo suggested, trying to ease the tension in the air. "Then we can talk a little if you'd like." Enzo led Luca to the dining room, where a simple yet abundant table of bread, fruit and juices was waiting. Luca sat down reluctantly, eyeing the food as though unsure whether he should eat. Life on the streets had made him cautious about everything, even something as simple as a meal. "Eat whatever you want, there's nothing to be afraid of here," Enzo said, trying to convey calm. Luca picked up a piece of bread, hesitant at first, but then took a small bite. Enzo watched him closely, looking for any clue, any reaction that might give him an idea of how to connect with the boy. The silence between them was uncomfortable, but Enzo knew that forcing a conversation wouldn't help. Luca needed time, and he was willing to wait as long as necessary. "I remember something," Luca murmured, breaking the silence. Enzo leaned forward, his heart racing. "What is it?" he asked, trying not to sound too desperate for answers. Luca placed the piece of bread back on the plate and looked at his hands, visibly disturbed by the images beginning to surface in his mind. "I remember being with my parents," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "But it's all blurry. We were in the car, I think. And then there was a loud sound, a bright light. And then, nothing." Enzo felt a chill down his spine. That description, vague as it was, brought back memories he preferred to forget. He had read the accident report countless times, trying to understand how something so terrible could have happened, but the answers never came. And now, hearing Luca mention the moments before the tragedy, brought all those questions rushing back. "You don't have to force yourself to remember everything at once, Luca," Enzo said, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "It'll take time, but we're in this too." Luca nodded, but the expression on his face showed that something was deeply troubling him. He was on the verge of some revelation, yet at the same time, he seemed to fear what he might find if he continued digging into his memories. After breakfast, Enzo suggested they go down to the mansion's basement, where he had stored several boxes of old family memories. Maybe seeing some photos and familiar objects would help Luca reconnect with his past. They walked there together, the silence between them filled with anticipation. The boxes were stacked in the corner, covered by a thin layer of dust, as if time had forgotten that place. Enzo began to open one of the boxes, pulling out old photo albums, toys from when Luca was little, and some personal belongings that had once belonged to Luca's parents. "Do you remember these toys?" Enzo asked, showing a small wooden car that used to be Luca's favorite. Luca looked at the car for a long moment, and something in his eyes changed. There was a spark of recognition, but also a deep sadness. "I vaguely remember," Luca replied, touching the car with the tips of his fingers. "I used to play with this, didn't I?" "Yes, you loved it. You'd spend hours down here in the basement with your toys, making up stories and racing them around." Enzo tried to smile, but the pain was still evident in his voice. The boy continued exploring the box, pulling out an old photo album. The pages were faded with time, but still showed clear images of happy moments. There were pictures of Luca as a baby, laughing in his mother Alessandra's arms, and of his father Domenico, always smiling beside his son. Luca flipped through the pages in silence, his eyes fixed on the images as if trying to make a connection with a life that now seemed so distant. "They were happy," Luca murmured, as a solitary tear rolled down his cheek. Why did everything have to change? Enzo had no answer. He asked himself that same question every day since the accident. There was no logical explanation for the cruel fate that had taken Domenico and Alessandra from their lives and left Luca lost in the world. "I would give anything to change what happened, Luca," Enzo said, his voice thick with emotion. "But now we have to move forward. We are going to find out what really happened, and above all, we're going to rebuild what's left." Days passed, and the routine at the Castellani mansion began to stabilize, though the atmosphere was far from peaceful. Luca remained distant, and his fragmented memories only heightened the feeling that something much darker was lurking behind it all. Enzo, on the other hand, felt a growing need to act. He could no longer sit idly by, just waiting for Luca's memories to return on their own. He decided to seek professional help. Salvatore, an old friend and a trusted private detective of the family, was called to the mansion. Enzo knew he could help them investigate the accident more thoroughly. When Salvatore arrived, his strong and determined presence brought a mixture of relief and unease. They had worked together on investigations before, and Enzo trusted that Salvatore wouldn't leave any saint. "Enzo, it's good to see you," Salvatore greeted with a firm handshake. "I've heard there's been an unexpected turn of events." "Yes, Salvatore," Enzo sighed, feeling the weight of the situation growing heavier. "Luca is alive, but he doesn't remember anything about the accident or how he survived. I need your help to understand what really happened. The police closed the case as an accident, but something doesn't feel right." Salvatore nodded, his eyes filled with determination. He had never trusted easy conclusions, and his instinct told him there was more to uncover. "I'll get started right away," he said, pulling out a notebook and adjusting his coat. "Give me all the information you have, and I'll re-examine the crash site, as well as speak with some people who may have been overlooked in the initial investigation." As Salvatore threw himself headfirst into the investigation, Enzo found himself in a constant state of anxiety. He knew the detective was thorough, but he feared what they might uncover. With each passing day, the tension grew. Luca also seemed more restless, and Enzo felt that the boy was getting closer to a truth that perhaps even he wasn't ready to face. After a week of intense investigation, Salvatore returned to the mansion with a serious expression. He asked Enzo to sit down, as if preparing him for what he was about to reveal. "Enzo, what I've discovered won't be easy to hear," Salvatore began, his voice firm but compassionate. "I reviewed all the documents from the accident and spoke with some people, including eyewitnesses who were never officially heard. What I found leads me to believe that the accident wasn't what it seemed." Enzo felt his stomach turn. He had known something was wrong, but hearing it out loud made his whole body tremble. "What do you mean?" Enzo asked, his voice barely audible. Salvatore opened a folder of documents he had brought with him, spreading photos and reports across the table in front of them. "These are the tire marks from the accident scene. They don't just match Domenico's car. There are signs of another vehicle at the scene, a car that, according to the evidence, pushed Domenico's car off the road." Enzo's eyes widened. The idea that the accident might have been caused by someone else was more than he could bear. "So you're saying that someone attacked them? That it was premeditated?" Enzo tried to stay calm, but anger and desperation were beginning to take over. "That's what all the evidence points to," Salvatore confirmed. "But there's more. I went to the hospital where Alessandra was taken. I spoke with a nurse who was on duty that night. She remembers something that wasn't included in the official report. Alessandra, before she went into a coma, tried to say something. She was visibly agitated, as if she wanted to warn someone about something, but they couldn't understand what it was." Enzo was speechless. What had Alessandra known? And why had she tried to warn someone about something just before losing consciousness? He clenched his fists, feeling the anger grow in his chest. For all these years he had trusted the police's conclusions, believing it had been a tragic accident. Now, everything he thought he knew was falling apart. "What about Luca?" Enzo asked, his voice filled with anguish. "What did you find out about how he survived?" Salvatore paused, choosing his words carefully. "That's the biggest mystery. Luca was presumed dead along with his parents, but the body they claimed was Luca's was never officially identified. They assumed it was him due to the extent of the damage in the accident. But now, with Luca alive, it's clear there was a mistake. The problem is, back then, no one asked questions. Everyone accepted the official version." Enzo felt a wave of crushing guilt. He had accepted that version. He hadn't questioned it, hadn't asked for more detailed answers. But now, with Luca back, he couldn't ignore the doubts any longer. He needed to find out who had caused the accident and, more importantly, why Luca had been on the streets all these years, without memory, without family. "Salvatore, what do we do now?" Enzo asked, the determination in his voice renewed. "How do we find out what really happened?" "We'll have to dig deeper, Enzo," Salvatore replied. "I believe Alessandra knew something dangerous. Maybe that's connected to what happened that night. We need to find out what she knew and why Domenico and Luca were involved. And for that, I'll need to investigate the circle around Domenico. It's likely he was involved in something bigger than we imagined." Enzo watched Luca on the other side of the room. The boy was sitting near the window, staring at the horizon, his thoughts in a faraway place. Salvatore had returned to the investigation, promising to dig deeper into Domenico and Alessandra's past, but what he had revealed so far was already enough to completely shake the reality Enzo believed he knew. The idea that the accident wasn't just an accident, and that Alessandra had tried to warn someone, was something he couldn't shake from his mind. What had she known? And why would Domenico, the most honest man he had ever known, be involved in something so dangerous? "Grandpa," Luca's soft voice interrupted Enzo's thoughts. Enzo turned to the boy, his eyes meeting Luca's, which now seemed darker and filled with doubt. "Yes, Luca," he replied, moving closer to his grandson. I've been dreaming about the accident," Luca began, his voice trembling. "But I don't know if they're memories or if my mind is just making things up." Enzo felt his heart tighten. He knew Luca was trying to remember, and any detail could be crucial. "What have you been dreaming about, Luca?" Enzo asked, sitting beside the boy and holding his hand, trying to offer some comfort. Luca took a deep breath before starting. "It always starts in the car. We're driving down a road, my parents are talking. I can't hear what they're saying, but it seems like something is worrying them." He closed his eyes, trying to focus. "Then suddenly there's a turn and I remember the sound of the tires screeching, my mom screaming, and then everything goes quiet." The silence between them was sharp. Luca kept his eyes closed, struggling to gather more details, but the darkness that followed in his mind seemed impenetrable. "I know there's more, something I'm forgetting, but I just can't remember," Luca said, frustrated, rubbing his face with his hands. Enzo squeezed the boy's hand tighter, trying to hide his own frustration. He knew he couldn't force Luca to remember, but each small detail seemed to bring the puzzle pieces together. The problem was that the pieces were still scattered, and he feared that when they finally put it all together, the truth might be more painful than any of them were prepared to face. "You're doing great, Luca," Enzo said, trying to reassure him. "You don't have to push yourself. When you're ready, more memories will come. And in the meantime, I'm here with you. We won't face this alone." Luca nodded, though the emotional exhaustion was clear on his face. He stood up and began to walk around the room, running his fingers over the old furniture as if the contact with the surroundings helped anchor him to reality. "Do you think my father was involved in something dangerous?" Luca asked suddenly, his voice heavy with the pain that question caused him. Enzo swallowed hard. That was the question he feared most. Everything Salvatore had uncovered pointed to something big, something Domenico had been involved in. But the idea that his son could have been part of something criminal was almost unbearable. "I don't know, Luca," Enzo said honestly. "But if he was, there must have been a good reason. Your father was a man of integrity with strong morals. Maybe he was deceived or forced into something. But I believe he did what he thought was best to protect you and your mother." Luca stopped walking and looked at Enzo. His eyes were full of uncertainty and pain, but also a growing determination. "I want to know the truth, Grandpa. I need to understand what happened to my parents and why I'm here with no memories, with nothing. I can't keep living like this." Enzo stood up and walked over to Luca, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders. "We will find the truth, Luca. I promise you, no matter what happened, we'll face it together. But we have to be patient. Sometimes the answers don't come as quickly as we'd like." Luca nodded again, but the weight of uncertainty still hung over them. As Enzo tried to comfort him, he knew that time was running out. More and more, he felt that they were closing in on something monumental, something that would change everything. The next day, Salvatore returned to the mansion with new information. This time he seemed more concerned than in previous visits. "Enzo, I have something important to share," he said, as soon as he was welcomed into the living room. "I've been digging deeper into Domenico's connections, and I've discovered something you may not have known about." Enzo looked at Salvatore, his expression becoming more serious. He knew that with each new discovery, things were getting more complicated. "Tell me, Esseo. I'm ready to hear it." Salvatore leaned forward, lowering his voice as if to keep the information confidential. Domenico was involved in a negotiation with an influential group. It appears he believed he was working on an important financial project, but in reality he was being manipulated. When he discovered the group's true objectives, he tried to get out. But leaving wasn't an option. Enzo felt a wave of dread wash over him. The son he knew would never have gotten involved in something so dangerous. The idea that Domenico had been the victim of a trap filled him with both anger and despair. "They threatened him, didn't they?" Enzo asked, already knowing the answer before Salvatore spoke. "Yes, and not just him. Alessandra knew something as well. I believe that's why she tried to warn someone before slipping into a coma. She knew they were in danger." The next morning brought a heavy atmosphere to the Castellani mansion. The air seemed thicker, and the walls that had always symbolized safety and protection now felt suffocating to Enzo. Salvatore's revelations echoed in his mind like distant thunder, constant and unsettling. He knew that as painful as the truth was, they had to keep going. Luca was still withdrawn, but something in his posture had changed. The revelation that his father, Domenico, might have been involved in something dangerous left him unsettled, but also motivated to find out more. The silence between him and Enzo during breakfast reflected the many questions weighing on both of them. After they finished eating in silence, Luca got up from the table and, without saying a word, walked toward the hallway that led to Enzo's study. The old man knew Luca wanted answers. He wanted them too. Determined not to waste any more time, Enzo followed his grandson. "Grandpa, what are we going to do now?" Luca asked, his voice low but filled with determination. "If my father was threatened, if my mother knew something, we have to find out everything. We can't stop now." Enzo nodded, his expression serious. "Salvatore is working on it, but we can help too," he replied as he moved toward the desk in the study. "There are things about Domenico and Alessandra's past that I never wanted to revisit, but maybe it's time." With those words, Enzo unlocked a drawer and took out an old wooden box. Inside were documents, letters, and some family mementos that had been tucked away for a long time. It was a piece of the past he had kept hidden, afraid to relive the pain. But now he knew he had to uncover these secrets. "Here are some of your father's letters, Luca," Enzo said, handing the boy a handful of old letters and papers. "Maybe we'll find something that gives us a clue about what was going on." Luca took the letters with trembling hands, as if he were holding fragments of a life he barely remembered. He began to read in silence, his eyes scanning each line, searching for any sign of danger. Meanwhile, Enzo sifted through other documents, trying to find something that connected with the information Salvatore had uncovered. After several long minutes, Luca stopped, his eyes fixed on one particular letter. "Grandpa, I think I found something," he said, holding the letter up for Enzo to see. The letter, handwritten, appeared to be from someone Enzo didn't immediately recognize, but the content was clear. Domenico had been involved in a series of financial transactions with a group whose intentions weren't openly described, but which hinted at shady dealings. The language was vague, but it was enough to send a chill down Enzo's spine. "Domenico was trying to get out," Enzo murmured, reading the last part of the letter. He wanted to protect you, but he was afraid he wouldn't be able to. Alessandra knew. That's why she tried to warn someone in the hospital. She knew they were being followed. Luca remained silent, taking in the words. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness. His father wasn't the criminal he had feared, but a man trapped in something much bigger, trying to protect his family. He didn't know who he was dealing with, Luca said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. He thought he was helping, but by the time he realized the danger, it was too late. Enzo placed his hand on Luca's shoulder. Your father was a good man, Luca, and he would have done anything to protect you. Now, it's up to us to find out exactly who he was dealing with and what really happened that night. At that moment, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion. Enzo and Luca exchanged glances. They weren't expecting anyone. Enzo got up slowly and walked to the door. Upon opening it, he saw Salvatore, his expression more serious than ever. Enzo, Luca, Salvatore began, hesitating. I've discovered something new, but you need to be prepared. What I'm about to tell you will change everything. Enzo invited Salvatore inside, and the detective got straight to the point. I dug deeper into the group Domenico was involved with. It's not a simple financial scheme, Enzo, Salvatore said, his voice grave. It's a criminal organization, and they have deep connections in various sectors, including politics and industry. When Domenico realized what was really going on, he tried to leave, but they didn't allow it. That's why the accident happened. It was all planned. Enzo felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. The revelation that the accident had been orchestrated as a way to silence Domenico was devastating. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. They killed him. Enzo Wyss. And Alessandra. She knew, didn't she? Yes, Salvatore confirmed. She found out what was happening, and that's probably why she tried to escape. She knew they were in danger, but they couldn't get away in time. Luca, who had been silent until now, suddenly stood up. They killed my parents, he shouted, his voice full of rage and pain. And I spent years on the streets, not knowing anything. Why didn't anyone do something? Why didn't anyone come looking for me? Salvatore sighed, his expression showing the pain of not having easy answers. They're powerful, Luca. The accident was covered up and no one questioned the official story. Until now. Enzo, feeling the anger and sadness in his grandson, tried to calm him. We will get justice, Luca. I promise. We won't let this end like this. Luca looked at his grandfather, tears shining in his eyes. I want justice, Grandpa. I want them to pay for what they did. And they will, Enzo said firmly, as his own anger grew inside him. We're going to bring this organization down, even if it's the last thing I do. The days following Salvatore's revelation were filled with constant tension. The Castellani mansion, once a refuge of peace, now seemed surrounded by shadows and invisible dangers. Enzo, Luca, and Salvatore spent hours meeting, discussing the best way to handle the situation, aware that the criminal organization responsible for Domenico and Alessandra's deaths was no ordinary enemy. They would need to be cautious and strategic if they wanted to expose the truth and get justice. That morning, Enzo woke up early, determined. He knew that to protect Luca and honor the memory of his children, he needed to devise a plan that would dismantle the organization without tipping them off to their intentions. Sitting in his study, looking at the photos of Domenico and Alessandra on his desk, he felt a mix of pain and anger. He was determined to avenge his family no matter the cost. Salvatore arrived shortly after, with new information. He had spent the last few nights investigating the most influential members of the organization and mapping out their connections. Now, with a list of names in hand, they were ready to act. Enzo, Luca, we have an opportunity, Salvatore said, opening the folder with the documents. I found out that one of the leaders of the organization, a man named Riccardo Gallucci, will be attending a secret meeting in 3 days at a secluded property on the outskirts of the city. This could be our chance to get concrete evidence. Luca, who had been listening in silence, stepped closer to the table. His eyes were filled with determination, but also with a pain he could barely contain. Concrete evidence? Luca asked, his voice dripping with disdain. I don't just want evidence, I want them to pay for what they did to my parents. Enzo looked at his grandson, feeling the same fury. He knew Luca was thirsty for justice, but he also knew they had to be smart about how they proceeded. I understand your anger, Luca, Enzo said, trying to stay calm, but we need to act carefully. If we rush, they could get away. We need solid evidence to hand over to the authorities and make sure they pay for everything. Salvatore nodded, backing up Enzo's words. We need a careful approach. We can't just storm the place. Security will be tight, and if we make the wrong move, we'll be putting our lives at risk. The goal is to get into the meeting, capture recordings or documents that prove Gallucci and his organization's involvement, and get out undetected. Luca clenched his fists, but he knew Salvatore and Enzo were right. He couldn't let his anger blind him. He needed to be strategic, even though every fiber of his being wanted to confront the men who had destroyed his family. So what's the plan? Luca asked, still struggling to contain his rage. Salvatore leaned over the table, pointing to a map of the property where the meeting would take place. The property has a heavily guarded main entrance, but I found a vulnerable point in the back. We can infiltrate through the garden, where security is lighter. With the right disguise, we can enter as staff for the event, probably part of the catering or maintenance crew. Once inside, I'll plant some listening devices and hidden cameras to record the conversations. Our goal is to catch Gallucci admitting his involvement in criminal activities. Enzo watched as the plan unfolded, his mind already working on how each detail needed to be executed perfectly. He knew it was up to them to get this right, as any mistake would be costly. I'm going with you, Luca said suddenly, surprising both Enzo and Salvatore. Luca, Enzo began, but Luca interrupted him. No, Grandpa. This isn't something I can walk away from. This fight is mine too. They killed my parents, left me on the streets. I need to be part of this. Enzo looked at his grandson, seeing no longer the fragile boy he had found weeks ago, but a determined young man, ready to face his own demons. He knew he couldn't protect Luca from everything anymore, and that the boy needed this moment of revenge as much as he did. All right, Enzo finally said, nodding. But you'll follow Salvatore's instructions. We need to be discreet. This isn't about blind revenge, it's about making sure they pay for what they did. Definitively. Luca agreed, though the anger still flashed in his eyes. He knew he would need to control his impulses for the plan to work. In the days leading up to the meeting, Enzo, Luca, and Salvatore prepared meticulously. They studied the layout of the property, practiced their disguises, and discussed every detail of the infiltration. Salvatore provided listening devices and cameras that would be discreetly placed during the event, and Luca was instructed on how to behave inside the property to avoid drawing attention. Finally, the night of the meeting arrived. Enzo, Luca, and Salvatore, disguised as catering staff, approached the back entrance of the property where security was minimal. Enzo's heart was racing. This was the moment of truth. All right, we're in, Salvatore whispered as they passed through the secondary entrance and blended in with the other staff. Luca, his heart pounding in his chest, followed Salvatore and Enzo's lead. The luxurious atmosphere of the property starkly contrasted with the tension they felt. They were assigned to serve drinks and move discreetly among the guests, who spoke in hushed tones, discussing business that, to the untrained eye, seemed normal, but Enzo knew was far. As they moved through the crowd, Salvatore quietly installed the listening devices and hidden cameras at strategic points. Gallucci was at the center of the room, surrounded by his trusted men, seemingly unaware that he was about to be caught in his own web. Luca watched from a distance, adrenaline surging through him. At any moment they would have the proof they needed. Suddenly, one of the cameras captured Gallucci speaking with another man in a more secluded corner of the room. This project needs to be completed soon, Gallucci said in a low tone, but his voice was clearly picked up. We need to keep control of everything. Domenico was becoming a problem, but we took care of it. He and his wife. It was about time. Now, no one will stop us. Enzo, who was monitoring the audio through an earpiece, felt his body freeze. There it was, the confession they needed. Gallucci had just admitted his involvement in the deaths of Domenico and Alessandra, but before he could fully process their victory, something happened. One of the security guards in the room looked directly at Luca, as if he had recognized something. Luca's heart raced. "Enzo, we've been spotted," Salvatore murmured, noticing the guard's stare. "We need to leave, now." The plan was in jeopardy, and they needed to escape before they were fully discovered. "Let's go," Enzo whispered to Luca, as they discreetly moved toward the back exit. But before they could leave the property, a shout echoed through the hall. "Get them!" the guard yelled, pointing at Luca. The chase was on. The sound of footsteps rushing toward them echoed through the luxurious corridors of the property. The guard's shout had turned the once calm meeting into pure chaos. Enzo, Luca, and Salvatore knew they had no time to lose. They needed to get out of there immediately, before they were captured, or worse, silenced for good. "This way," Salvatore whispered, gesturing to a side door that led to the back of the building. Luca, his heart pounding, followed his grandfather and Salvatore as they slipped through narrow corridors, trying to stay calm. The sound of voices behind them grew louder with every second, and the guards were closing in. Enzo, who had managed to maintain his composure until now, felt his mind racing. He knew that this critical moment would define their future. They had Gallucci's confession, the proof that Domenico and Alessandra had been murdered, but what good would it be if they couldn't make it out alive? "This way." Salvatore pushed open the back door, shoving Luca and Enzo outside into the dark garden. "We need to blend into the bushes until we find the back gate." The night was cold, and the wind howled through the tall trees, creating an eerie atmosphere. As they ran, their feet crunched on the gravel path, but the adrenaline driving them forward made them ignore it. Salvatore led the way, his eyes frantically searching for a safe exit. "We need to reach the car," Enzo said, struggling to catch his breath. "Salvatore, do you have the recorded audio? We need it intact." "It's all here," Salvatore replied, tapping the small recording device hidden under his coat. "But it won't matter if they catch us first." Luca kept glancing over his shoulder, feeling the tension tighten in his chest. He could see the shadows of the guards getting closer. The fear of being caught was almost paralyzing, but he knew he couldn't fail. He had to get justice for his parents, no matter the cost. Suddenly, one of the guards appeared in front of them, stepping out from one of the garden paths. He raised a gun, pointing it directly at Enzo. "Don't take another step," the man shouted, his voice filled with authority. Luca froze, his eyes wide with terror. Time seemed to slow as the guard moved closer. Enzo instinctively stepped forward, placing himself between his grandson and the armed man. His heart pounded wildly, but he knew he couldn't show fear. Not now. "We don't have to do this," Enzo said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We can leave without causing any trouble. We don't want a fight." The guard, however, didn't seem interested in negotiating. His eyes glinted with determination. "You don't have a choice. You're coming back inside, and we'll settle this there," he said, gesturing with the gun. Salvatore, who had been silent until now, realized there was no time for more talking. In a swift motion, he moved to the side, grabbing a fallen branch from the ground and hurling it at the guard. The blow was perfect, striking the man's hand and causing him to drop the gun for a brief moment. "Run!" Salvatore yelled, seizing the brief second of distraction. Luca and Enzo ran as fast as they could toward the back gate. The sound of footsteps and shouting behind them grew louder than ever, but the adrenaline pushed them forward. Finally, they reached the gate. Salvatore, already out of breath, pushed open the heavy iron structure, which creaked as it swung open, revealing the dark, empty road outside. The car wasn't far away. "Get in!" Salvatore ordered as he rushed to the driver's seat. As soon as everyone was inside the car, Salvatore slammed his foot on the gas and the vehicle sped down the deserted road. The screech of the tires echoed through the air as the mansion grew smaller in the distance. In the back seat, Luca was trying to catch his breath, his thoughts still chaotic. He looked over at Enzo, who was staring out at the horizon, as if still trying to process everything that had happened. "We did it," Luca said, his voice low but filled with relief. "We have Gallucci's confession. Now they'll pay." Enzo nodded slowly, but the expression on his face showed that he was still worried. "We have the confession, yes, but this is only the beginning, Luca. The organization is still running, and now they know we're after them. Things are going to get more dangerous. Salvatore, who had been focused on the road, glanced at them through the rearview mirror. Enzo's right. We got an important piece of evidence, but Gallucci and his men won't rest until they silence us. We need to act fast and take this to the authorities before they make their next move. Luca, despite his exhaustion, nodded. He knew the battle was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time he felt hope. His parents wouldn't be forgotten, and justice would finally be served. When they arrived at Salvatore's safe house, a small warehouse on the outskirts of the city, they immediately started reviewing the recording they had obtained. Gallucci's voice confessing to the murder of Domenico and Alessandra was crystal clear. "This is enough," Salvatore said, after listening to the recording. "We have the proof. Now we need to hand it over to someone we can trust." "But who can we trust?" Enzo asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Gallucci has influence in every sector. We need to be sure the right person gets this information." Salvatore was silent for a moment, thinking. "I know a prosecutor who can help. He's not on Gallucci's payroll, and he's determined to take down these kinds of organizations. But we'll need to be discreet when we hand over this recording." Luca, who had been quiet until now, spoke with determination. "Let's do it. No matter how dangerous it is, we're so close. We can't stop now." Enzo looked at his grandson, admiring his resolve. He knew Luca was right. They had come too far to turn back. The risk was high, but the reward, justice for Domenico and Alessandra, was greater. The next morning, the air was thick with tension as Enzo, Luca, and Salvatore prepared for the next step. They knew handing over the evidence to the prosecutor wouldn't be simple, especially with Gallucci's organization on high alert after the previous night's escape. The warehouse they were hiding in felt cramped, as if the walls were silent witnesses to the crucial decision about to be made. Enzo looked at Luca, who, despite his young age, was showing admirable strength. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Enzo asked, knowing that the next few hours would be the most dangerous of their lives. "We don't have a choice, Grandpa," Luca responded firmly. "If we don't do this, they'll get away with it, and everything my parents went through will have been for nothing." Salvatore, who had been checking the equipment and adjusting the disguises they would use for the handoff, turned to the two of them. "We need to be quick and discreet. The prosecutor is trustworthy, but Gallucci has eyes everywhere. If he senses anything suspicious, we could be dead before we even make it to court." Enzo nodded, but his mind was on high alert. They were stepping into a zone of extreme danger. Although they had the evidence, the game was far from over. "All right, let's go," Salvatore said, slinging a bag with security devices over his shoulder. "The prosecutor will meet us in an underground parking lot. We'll be safe there, but we need to move fast." The drive to the location was tense, with everyone in the car hyper-aware of every movement on the road. Luca, sitting in the back seat, watched the streets of Milan flash by through the window. The silence in the car was palpable, each of them lost in their own thoughts, aware that they were risking everything. When they finally arrived at the underground parking lot, Salvatore guided them to a darker, more secluded corner. The place was empty, except for a single black car parked in the distance. Salvatore recognized the vehicle as belonging to the prosecutor. "There he is," Salvatore said, pointing. "Let's be quick." They got out of the car and walked toward the prosecutor. The man, middle-aged with a serious and determined expression, stepped out of his car and greeted them quickly. "Salvatore, Enzo," he said, nodding toward Luca. "Do you have the evidence?" "It's right here," Salvatore replied, pulling the recording from his pocket and handing it to the prosecutor. "This proves that Gallucci was involved in the murder of Domenico and Alessandra. He confessed everything during the meeting." The prosecutor looked at the device, his expression unreadable. "You've done an excellent job," he said, placing the recording in the inner pocket of his jacket. "Now we need to bring this to court and build the case." But before they could continue the conversation, the sound of screeching tires echoed through the parking lot. Suddenly, several cars appeared, surrounding the area. Armed men jumped out of the vehicles, and within seconds, Salvatore, Enzo, and Luca realized they had walked into a trap. "Run!" Salvatore shouted, pulling Enzo and Luca toward their car. But it was too late. Gallucci's men were already closing in on them, weapons drawn. The prosecutor, looking nervous, took a step back, clearly say, "This wasn't supposed to happen," he exclaimed. But before he could do anything else, one of the armed men grabbed him, dragging him away. Luca looked around, his heart pounding. There was no way out. They were trapped. "You thought you could defeat me?" A familiar voice echoed through the parking lot. Riccardo Gallucci stepped out of one of the cars, walking toward the group with a smug smile on his face. "You were clever, I'll admit that, but not clever enough. I always knew you'd try something." Enzo's body tensed. Seeing Gallucci up close, knowing he was the one responsible for the death of his son and daughter-in-law, brought a surge of rage that he could barely contain. "You will pay for everything you've done, Gallucci," Enzo said, his voice filled with hatred. "We have the proof. You can't escape the truth." Gallucci laughed as he walked closer to Enzo. "Proof? What proof?" he said, taking the recording device from the prosecutor's pocket and smashing it on the ground. "Now you have nothing. And you know what? No one will believe you." Luca, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward, his anger boiling over. "You killed my parents!" he shouted, tears welling up in his eyes. "You destroyed our family!" Gallucci looked at Luca with disdain. "Your parents were obstacles, and obstacles need to be removed. Now the same will happen to you and your dear grandfather." Desperation took over Enzo and Salvatore. The situation seemed hopeless, surrounded by Gallucci's men, without evidence and with no chance of escape. But just as everything seemed lost, the distant sound of sirens began to approach. The police had been called. Enzo didn't know how, but a glimmer of hope lit up inside him. "Do you hear that, Gallucci?" Enzo said, feeling a flash of triumph. "Your game is over." Gallucci looked around, realizing that his time was running out. With a quick gesture, he signaled to his men. "Let's go," he shouted, as his thugs began retreating to their cars. Before leaving, Gallucci turned to Enzo with a look of hatred. "This isn't over, Enzo. I will finish what I started." With that, Gallucci got into his car and disappeared into the darkness, along with his men. The sirens grew louder, and finally the police arrived at the scene. The shaken prosecutor was taken for questioning, while Enzo, Luca, and Salvatore were surrounded by officers. "Are you all right?" one of the officers asked, looking around at the scene of destruction. Enzo took a deep breath, still trying to process everything that had just happened. "We're alive," he said, but his mind was focused on Gallucci. He knew this wouldn't be the last time they faced the man who had destroyed their family. With the evidence destroyed and Gallucci still on the loose, Enzo and Luca knew the fight was far from over. Now, with the police involved and the spotlight on them, they needed a new plan, one that would ensure that next time Gallucci wouldn't have anywhere to run. As they were taken away by the police to give their statements, Enzo looked at Luca, seeing the determination in his grandson's eyes. "This isn't over, Luca," he said, "but we will win. We'll take down Gallucci no matter the cost." That night in Salvatore's hideout, the trio sat around a table, the weight of their next steps heavy in the air. Enzo, who had always kept his calm, now seemed burdened with the weight of the world. "Gallucci knows we're after him," Enzo began, looking at Luca and Salvatore. "Now he's going to double his efforts to take us down. If we don't act quickly, he might try to eliminate us before we can gather new evidence." "We need a different strategy," Salvatore said, analyzing maps and documents spread across the table. "This time, we can't infiltrate. Gallucci's on high alert. He'll be expecting us wherever we try to go." Luca, who had been quiet until now, looked at the two of them with renewed determination. "He's going to pay for what he did," Luca said, his voice low but firm. "And if we can't gather new evidence the traditional way, then we'll make him confess publicly." Enzo frowned, confused. "What do you mean, Luca?" Luca stood up from his chair, the gears in his mind clearly turning at full speed. "Gallucci is proud. He always wants to be in control of everything and brag about his victories," Luca explained, his voice gaining strength as the idea formed. "If we can confront him in a public place, force him to react emotionally, he might slip up and confess in front of witnesses." "This is risky, Luca," Enzo replied, thinking about how volatile Gallucci could be. "If something goes wrong, we could end up dead right there." "It's risky, but it's our best chance," Luca insisted. "He already sees us as a threat. If we press him at the right moment, in a place where he can't easily escape, we can catch him. Salvatore crossed his arms, thinking it over. Luca's right. Gallucci is driven by ego and a need for control. If we can manipulate that, he might expose himself. But we need to make sure the place is secure and the police are nearby in case things get out of hand. Enzo sighed, knowing that Luca's idea, although risky, was the only real option they had left. They were without physical evidence, with few allies within the system, and Gallucci was ahead in many ways. The only thing they had now was the courage and determination to bring him down. "All right," Enzo finally agreed. "We'll do it your way, Luca, but we'll need a solid plan. We need to pick the right place and the right time." In the days that followed, they meticulously set the stage. The location they chose was a large public square in the center of Milan, a busy place where Gallucci wouldn't be able to escape unnoticed. They knew he would be there for a meeting with some influential members of the city, and that would be the perfect moment to confront him. Salvatore contacted the prosecutor, who, despite being shaken by the previous ambush, promised to be ready with the police, watching from a distance and prepared to act if Gallucci made any suspicious moves. The day arrived. The square was full of people going about their day, unaware they were about to witness the climax of a long-standing battle between Enzo Castellani and Riccardo Gallucci. Luca, Enzo, and Salvatore were strategically positioned, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Finally, Gallucci appeared, accompanied by some of his men. He looked relaxed, as if the world was under his control, unaware that he was about to fall into his own trap. Luca was the first to act. He approached Gallucci, his heart pounding in his chest, but holding his head high. When he was just a few meters away, he shouted, his voice echoing through the square. "Gallucci!" Luca called out, loud enough to catch the attention of the people around him. "Your game is over. You're going to pay for what you did to my parents." Gallucci stopped, his expression shifting from surprise to disdain. He looked at Luca as if he were an insolent child. "Ah, it's you again," Gallucci said with a cynical smile. "I thought you had learned not to mess with people like me. Looks like I'll have to teach that lesson again." Luca didn't back down, staring at Gallucci with fierce intensity. "You killed my parents, you destroyed our family, and now you want to run again, but this time everyone here will know the truth." Gallucci took a few steps toward Luca, his men moving closer from behind, but he raised his hand, signaling them to stay back. "Your parents were fools who got involved in things they couldn't understand," Gallucci said, his voice low and threatening. "They paid the price for that, and so will you." Luca stood his ground, even with the fury burning inside him. "So you admit it? You killed Domenico and Alessandra Castellani?" The crowd around them began to stop, with some people curiously watching the scene. Gallucci, unaware of the danger, kept talking, unable to contain his arrogance. "Yes, I killed them," he said with a cruel smile. "They were eliminated because they were a problem for me, and if you keep going, you'll end up the same way." This was the moment Enzo and Salvatore had been waiting for. The very second Gallucci confessed publicly, Salvatore discreetly signaled to the police, who had been watching from a distance. Within moments, police cars surrounded the square, and officers stepped out with their weapons drawn. "Riccardo Gallucci," one of the officers shouted, "you're under arrest." Gallucci looked around, his confidence evaporating as he saw the guns aimed at him and the crowd of witnesses who had heard his confess. He tried to retreat, but it was too late. The officers surrounded him and immediately handcuffed him. Luca watched as Gallucci was taken away, the anger in his eyes now replaced with a sense of justice fulfilled. "We did it, Grandpa," Luca said, looking at Enzo, who approached and placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Yes, we did," Enzo replied, a mix of relief and emotion in his voice. "Your parents can finally rest in peace." Salvatore, standing beside them, looked on with a satisfied smile. They had won, and Gallucci would finally pay for his crimes. In the days that followed, Riccardo Gallucci's trial became a widely covered event in the media. The recorded confessions, the witnesses, and the evidence finally dismantled the criminal organization he had run for years. Luca, Enzo, and Salvatore watched the end of that chapter with heavy hearts, but also with the certainty that, despite the pain, they had achieved justice for Domenico and Alessandra. Now they could move forward, knowing they had done the right thing. The Castellani mansion, once marked by sadness and loss, began to find new life. Luca, still young but stronger than ever, knew he had a long road ahead, but this time with the certainty that his family had been avenged. On the mansion's veranda under the setting sun, Enzo and Luca looked out at the horizon, ready to face whatever came next, now as a family strengthened by the truth. "You know, Grandpa, I don't know if I'll ever forget everything we've been through," Luca said, his eyes fixed on the vibrant colors of the sky. "But for the first time, I feel at peace." Enzo smiled, a genuine and full smile that carried years of pain, resilience, and finally, healing. "We can't always forget, Luca," Enzo said softly, his voice comforting, "but we can move forward. Now we can honor your parents' memory by living the way they would have wanted, with love, courage, and happiness." Luca nodded, emotional as he thought about the happy moments he had shared with Domenico and Alessandra before the tragedy. He knew his journey had been tough, but with his grandfather's and Salvatore's strength, he had found what mattered most: purpose and family. Suddenly, Salvatore appeared at the door, holding a bottle of wine with a mischievous smile on his face. "Don't you think it's time to celebrate?" he asked, shaking the bottle. "I can't remember the last time we opened a good bottle of wine here. It's time to toast to the new chapter for this family." Luca and Enzo laughed, the lightness finally filling the air. It was the first time in many years they allowed themselves a moment of happiness without the weight of guilt or pain. They stood up, and the three of them gathered around the table on the veranda, where Salvatore poured the wine as the sky above them darkened with stars. "A toast," Salvatore began, raising his glass, "to courage, to truth, and to the future. May this be just the start of a new journey. To family," Enzo added, his eyes filled with emotion. Luca, holding his glass, looked at the two men before him, figures who, despite all the adversities, had stayed by his side. He took a deep breath, feeling relieved that, finally, things were in their rightful place. "And to the memory of my parents," he said, raising his glass, "may they know I'll never forget them, and that their fight wasn't in vain." The glasses clinked softly in the air, and a comfortable silence settled among them. They didn't need words to understand what that moment represented. It was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The pain and suffering had left their marks, but love, justice, and hope were stronger. After the toast, Luca stepped away for a moment and walked into the garden where he used to play with his parents. The full moon illuminated the path, and he could feel their presence there, as if Domenico and Alessandra were smiling down at him, proud. "I did this for you," Luca murmured, looking up at the starry sky. "And I promise that from now on, I'll live the life you always dreamed for me." A gentle breeze brushed against his face, and he felt as though it were one last embrace from his parents, a silent confirmation that they were at peace and that he could finally move on. Returning to the veranda, Luca rejoined Enzo and Salvatore. They continued talking, laughing, and sharing stories, remembering the good times and planning for the future. It was a night of healing and renewal. As the night wore on, Luca stood up, now with a new light in his eyes. "You know, Grandpa, I've been thinking I'd like to help other people who've gone through what we have. Maybe start a foundation or something to support victims of injustice. I think that's what my parents would have done." Enzo smiled, proud to see how much Luca had matured. "I think it's a wonderful idea, Luca. Your father and mother would be so proud of you, and so am I. Let's do it together." Salvatore, always practical, raised his glass again. "To new adventures, because life is full of them, and we're just getting started." Life at the Castellani mansion would never be the same, but this time, the change was welcome. The love that had been scarred by the past was now blooming with new strength, and despite all the obstacles, the family was united. And that night, as the stars shone brightly over the mansion, Enzo, Luca, and Salvatore knew that the future, though uncertain, would be built on what truly mattered: family, truth, and love. Finally, they were free to live. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to get the next video right away. Share this with your friends, and check out the video on the end screen. You'll be moved.